Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed Case for a Creator book club. And I see Moldy Apple has already joined us. Sorry I'm a little bit late. I hope this makes up for the creationist books collecting dust on the shelf. I have one titled Evolution, The Fossils Say No. I wonder if that's a good book. I haven't read Evolution, The Fossils Say No, so I don't know for sure if that one is good, but it sounds like a good one. And that is true. The fossil record does actually contradict the Darwinist narrative, the evolutionary narrative, as we're going to actually be talking about next week when we get into Darwin's Tree of Life. But before we get into that, this week we're going to be starting chapter 3, talking about whether or not macroevolution is actually scientific by going through we're going to be looking at Lee Strobel's interview with Jonathan Wells and examining his take on the various icons of evolution. Let's see. I just read a summary. Seems the author approaches the philosophical aspect of it where it tends to fall apart. That's awesome. Yeah, I would love to read that, actually. That sounds really interesting. Before we get too far into it, though, I do want to remind everybody to support the Orthodox Diocese of Alaska. I have a link in the description below where you can support the Orthodox Diocese of Alaska to help build schools in the native languages and have priests for the rural villages. It's definitely an important work, as St. Paul urged Christians all over the world to remember the poor of Jerusalem, because it was through Jerusalem that the gospel came to us. So too in the New World, the Jerusalem of the New World is the Orthodox Church in Alaska, because it was through them that the Orthodox Church came to the New World. And so we should not forget those poor who are suffering in our Jerusalem. So I always like to remind everybody of that. Now, just to review last week, we introduced the icons of evolution. So we saw that these are the method through which so-called science books are teaching this doctrine of evolution to students. And it is a doctrine. It's a doctrine that deserves to be examined just like anything else. As Moldy Apple was just talking about, it has philosophical implications that deserve to be examined. But it also deserves to be examined scientifically to discern whether or not the arguments put forward for Darwinian evolution actually have merit. And that's a discussion that a lot of people in our time simply don't seem to be willing to have. They poo-poo this whole discussion as backwards, anti-science, but is it really anti-science to examine these things scientifically? So last week, I introduced some of my misgivings about these icons of evolution, but now we're going to examine the actual chapter. We're going to start examining chapter 3, where Lee Strobel does just that. He interviews a scientist named Jonathan Wells and discusses with him about these very icons. But also last week, I think perhaps for me the most important part of the discussion last week was when I discussed why I believe Christianity and the theory of macroevolution, often called Darwinism, is incompatible. I don't believe that Orthodox Christianity can be reconciled with the Darwinian framework. And I realize that there are lots of people, some of them may be better Christians than I am, who disagree with me on that point. And if you're one of those people, I want you to know you are welcome here. You can post your comments, but I do ask that you go to last week's video on the icons of evolution and listen to the section. It's only about a 10-minute section. Listen to that section where I explain why I believe that evolution is not compatible with Christianity. And if you still believe that it is, then you can feel free to comment. Let me know why you believe that it is. But and I'd be happy to have that conversation with you. But I do ask that you hear out my perspective first. With that said, now that I have set the stage for my own belief that Christianity and macroevolution are incompatible, I am going to now go about through the rest of this book club or book study. We're going to be examining why, scientifically speaking, macroevolution doesn't work. So that starts here in chapter 3, where we're going to be looking at these icons of evolution in more depth. And what we're going to be seeing is, like I said, it's going to require multiple parts because we need to really examine these things more thoroughly than I can do in just a short time. And we really want to dissect and refute each of the icons of evolution, because until you've dissected these things thoroughly, it's very difficult for people to see that this is an ascientific theory, that there's no science behind the theory of macroevolution. And I realize that that's a really bold claim, because in our academic institutions in the West, we have so thoroughly been conditioned to believe in the theory of macroevolution that we don't even really question it anymore. It's just sort of assumed. And this is a huge problem. So I'm willing to have that conversation. I'm willing to be mocked by atheists. I'm willing to be made fun of, because at the end of the day, I believe that the truth matters more. So this chapter begins with two conflicting quotes and sets the stage for the debate. The first quote says, "No educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know is a simple fact." That is from evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr. On the other hand, in Science Digest, we read the following: "Scientists who utterly reject evolution may be one of the fastest growing controversial minorities. Many of the scientists supporting this position hold impressive credentials in science." That's from Larry Hatfield in Science Digest. By the way, I just want to point out that this book is actually, let's see, I just want to make sure I get this right. I think it's about 15 years old. Yeah, this book is actually 20 years old now, and that quote is more relevant than ever, because actually more and more, even among atheists, there has been a push to toss out the term Darwinism, because they feel that the Darwinian paradigm of evolution is increasingly difficult to substantiate from the scientific realm. That said, they're still teaching these things in like high school textbooks and even some college textbooks. So by no means is refuting Darwinism gone out the window. By no means is that an outdated necessity. But my point is that even in the secular community, people are starting to come around to the fact that this macroevolution simply doesn't work with the evidence. So we see a conflicting report. We see that contrary to what atheists are saying, and contrary to what snarky people like Ernst Mayr are saying, there's actually quite a bit of detraction from this theory of macroevolution. And I'm going to read a section of our book here of Case for a Creator that gets into this in a little bit more depth. And remember, everything he's saying, that this whole discipline has grown a lot since 2004 when this book was written. So almost 20 years ago, this book was written, and everything he's saying has only increased in its relevance to today. So on page 35, we read, "There were 100 of them, biologists, chemists, zoologists, physicists, anthropologists, molecular and cellular biologists, bioengineers, organic chemists, geologists, astrophysicists, and other scientists. Their doctorates came from such prestigious universities as Cambridge, Stanford, Cornell, Yale, Rutgers, Chicago, Princeton, Purdue, Duke, Michigan, Syracuse, Temple, and Berkeley. They included professors from Yale Graduate School, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Tulane, Rice, Emory, George Mason, Lehigh, and the universities of California, Washington, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Ohio, Colorado, Nebraska, Missouri, Iowa, Georgia, New Mexico, Utah, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere. Among them was the director of the Center for computational quantum chemistry and scientists at the Plasma Physics Lab at Princeton, the National Museum of History at the Smithsonian Institute, the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories. And they wanted the world to know one thing: they are skeptical. After spokespersons for the public broadcasting system's 7-part television series Evolution asserted, quote, "All known scientific evidence supports macroevolution," end quote. As does, quote, "virtually every reputable scientist in the world," end quote. These professors, laboratory researchers, and other scientists published a 2-page advertisement in a national magazine under the banner, "A Scientific Dissent from Darwinism." Their statement was direct and defiant. Quote, "We are skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life," they said. "Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged." So this brings me to a point that I've often made, which is the hypocrisy of those who call themselves skeptics. So often we hear that people say that they are skeptical, but then they accept Darwinian evolution without any skepticism. They accept this idea of macroevolution essentially on faith. They just accept, and even the arguments you'll hear for evolution are things like, well, all scientists agree that this is true, and even the scientists who disagree are actually just, these backwards people. So there's nobody truly disagreeing with evolution, so therefore we have to accept it. Well, that's not a scientific argument. That's an argument from peer pressure, perhaps, an argument from democracy, perhaps, the majority rules, but it's not an argument from science. So talk about blind faith. People every single day express blind faith in the doctrine of evolution. And it cracks me up because, for example, as I've been sharing this series around social media, I've noticed a trend that folks who are in opposition to what I'm saying accuse me of blind faith or of believing things without evidence and all kinds of things. And when I refute these claims, one of the things that I've often pointed out is the fact that The one who's actually embracing something without a shred of scientific evidence is the one who believes in Darwinian evolution. Because if you don't believe in, if you believe in macroevolution, you have to believe in it despite the fact that all of the evidence is against you. So these bold scientists refuse to have blind faith. These bold scientists stand up and say, together, despite the specter of professional persecution, they broached the politically incorrect opinion that the emperor of evolution has no clothes. Now, when I was in high school and even when I was in college, this sort of thing was not talked about. The fact that hundreds of scientists were actually in opposition to the teaching of evolution, the fact that there were all of these scientists with prestigious degrees who were skeptical of the theory of evolution, this was never discussed, never mentioned. It was always presented as if you had to choose between embracing the doctrine of macroevolution and being a science denier. So the thing is, why is this perspective so persecuted? Why is it that when I was in high school and I raised some objections to evolution, my teacher laughed at me and said in front of the class, well, you're just believing a stupid book that says that a whale is a fish. Why did he resort to that? Why did he resort to these sort of personal attacks and criticisms that had nothing to do with my question, that had nothing to do with my objection, which was rooted in science? Why does the BBC put out a series where they say that pretty much everybody believes in evolution and all evidence points to evolution, despite the fact that there's not a shred of evidence pointing to macroevolution? Why is all of this happening? It's because they have to pretend that there's a consensus that doesn't exist, because that is the only way that they can continue to push a narrative that the secular world has become based in. So think about it this way. Think about how powerful the psychiatric industry has become. And psychiatry, clinical psychiatry, most of the theories of clinical psychiatry are rooted in Darwinian evolution theory. So if we throw out the theory of macroevolution, then all of the power that these institutions have gained would naturally come into sharp criticism and sharp objectability. But we have to make these sort of stops along this journey. We can't just get ahead of ourselves. And I admit that I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But the point that I'm making here is simply that this is a disingenuous way of going about this argument. We need to examine these claims on their own merit, not be just doggedly clinging to the doctrine of evolution. On page 37, we read, "In my quest to determine if contemporary science points toward or away from God, I knew that I had to first examine the claims of evolution in order to conclude once and for all whether Darwinism creates a reasonable foundation for atheism. That's because if the materialism of Darwinian evolution is a fact, then the atheistic conclusions that I reached as a student might still be valid. Only after resolving this issue could I move ahead to assessing whether there is persuasive affirmative evidence for a creator." So that's why we have to go through this chapter, because it matters. We have to first assess whether or not the foundation upon which our opponents are even arguing is valid. So there are some Christians out there who have embraced this doctrine of evolution. Like I said, actually 2 weeks ago, but like I said in our last session, I don't see how that can work. I don't believe it can work. But those Christians have to take the step of demonstrating how the Christian worldview can fit this paradigm. But what I'm saying is that the first step is we have to examine the paradigm itself. Moldy Apple says they worship sense data. Some dude on an island looked at some birds and lizards. Whoop-de-doo. Epstein also did research on an island. Should we embrace his experiments too? Clown. As uncomfortable as that is, you make a valid point. The fact that there's this worship of sensory data, and science can be a useful tool, but science is in and of itself amoral. It has no moral one way or the other, which is why there was such a debate after World War II of whether we should use the medical research of Dr. Joseph Mengele, despite the fact that the way in which he went about that research was completely inhumane, disgusting, and horrendous. Should we use the findings to try to save lives? And interestingly enough, there was the two sides of that conclusion of that debate were not who you would think they would be. On the side saying that we should throw away all of his research and just burn it, was the sort of medical establishment. The international sort of establishment wanted to just do away with this because they were so offended that one of their own ranks would be behind such a horrible atrocity. On the other hand, the families of the victims wanted the research to be published so that their relatives would not have suffered all of this in vain, so that some good could come from what they had suffered. Not that what he did was good, but that what they suffered would produce good. And that's a really difficult question. I'm not pretending that I know which would have been the right answer. All I'm saying is that Moldy Apple makes a great point. Research in and of itself is not the only way of assessing truth. We need to have philosophy and theology and all of these other disciplines in order to come to a full, well-rounded perspective of truth. But part of this journey has to be, and if we're to carry on this task of apologetics, we have to be able to silence the extreporous. And what that means is that we have to be able to make these examinations. And the first step of this examination is to discuss the theory of evolution on scientific grounds. So in steps our first expert, which is Jonathan Wells. Jonathan Wells is a scientist. I'm going to get into his degrees. But his story is that he was raised a Christian, but then when he was in college, he learned about macroevolution and fell away from the faith like so many others have done, because from his perspective, now that he was learning about evolution, it basically put God out of the job. However, he has not, at least as recently as the articles that I read about him in preparation for this, if somebody has more recent information, then you can feel free to correct me in the comments or whatever. But in the articles I was reading, he is a theist and a prominent advocate of what's called intelligent design. So he believes that we should be teaching the doctrine of intelligent design instead of the doctrine of macroevolution, or that we should teach them both side by side and give people the opportunity to practice this amazing thing called critical thinking. So instead of only teaching macroevolution, teach both theories and allow young people to make up their mind for themselves. I know that is totally crazy, but that is actually what he advocates. However, he is not, at least not yet, a Christian. Yeah. No way. Yeah, it is mind-blowing, right? Like the idea that we should allow people to actually like cultivate thinking instead of just telling them what to believe. But yeah, but Jonathan Wells is not a Christian, so he is a proponent of something called Eastern Lightning, which is a cult from Asia, and they believe in a false Christ and actually believe that Jesus was reincarnated as a woman or something bizarre. That said, I know that, you might say, well, he's not a Christian, but I actually think that there's a lot of value in the fact that here's a man of science who is not a Christian, who is a proponent of intelligent design, and who is advocating that we take a step back from macroevolution. Because oftentimes this whole debate is framed as Christians versus secular people or Christians versus science. And Jonathan Wells is saying, no, it doesn't have to be that, because he's not a Christian. He is a scientist, and he's against macroevolution theory. So a little bit about Jonathan Wells. He has a PhD in molecular biology. He has written for scientific journals and written many, many technical articles. So he's written all kinds of stuff that would go way over my head, written all kinds of stuff that honestly would bore me to death, because if I'm honest with you guys, this is not the sort of thing I much prefer to read philosophy books and theology books. This is not the sort of thing that I read for fun. But I'm willing to read books like this so that I can better serve all of you people. But, I would much rather be reading Plato and Aristotle and stuff. But nevertheless, he also has a doctorate in religious studies, and with a particular focus on the controversy over Darwinism in the 19th century. So amazing intellectual might, kind of an intellectual heavyweight, and someone we should be paying close attention to. And this is a relevant topic because this is exactly what his PhD is in. So his PhD in molecular biology makes him uniquely qualified to discuss some of the things that we're going to be talking about. He's also written a book called Icons of Evolution: Science or Myth. And he explains why he uses the term icons of evolution. So, when asked why icons, Jonathan Wells said, so this is from page 40 of our book, Wells leaned forward, putting his elbows on the desk, because if you ask almost any scientist to describe the evidence for Darwinism, time after time, they give you the same examples. They're in our textbooks. They're what we teach our students. For many scientists, these are the evidence for evolution. And then, in addition to the four that influenced Lee Strobel that we talked about last week, there are also the similarity between bone structures in a bat's wing, a porpoise's flipper, and a horse's leg, and a human hand. This is touted as evidence of their origin in a common ancestor. Then there are the pictures in textbooks of peppered moths on tree trunks showing how camouflage and predatory birds result in a natural selection. Of course, there are Darwin's finches, the Galapagos Island birds that are also used to support natural selection. Probably the most famous icon, though, is the drawing we see parodied in so many cartoons, where an ape-like creature slowly evolves into a human being, which suggests that they were merely animals that evolved by purposeless natural selection. So these are the images that are used to teach natural selection, to teach Darwinism, macroevolution, whatever you want to call it. And so I'm saying let's put on our skeptic hats, and this is the skeptic's moment. This is the time for the true skeptics to stand up and play the role of the iconoclast. And so just as the iconoclasts of Christian history didn't like the fact that we Orthodox Christians use icons like this to teach the faith and practice the faith, so too now we have an opportunity to play that role by examining the icon and allowing ourselves to challenge these icons. And by the way, if you're a person who believes in evolution, you should have no problem with what we're doing, because we're asking you to do science. Let's examine these things scientifically. And if they succeed, then they succeed. If they fail, then they fail. So first of all, I've been saying micro, and I've been using this term macroevolution the whole time, macro versus microevolution the whole time. And I want to take a moment to get into that, because I have often been criticized for my use of this term, because people say, well, macroevolution is just microevolution over the course of millions and millions of years. So that is the thing is that microevolution is not in dispute. All Christians believe that within different kinds of animals there are small changes that take place over time that can result in. So, for example, Darwin's finches are not a challenge at all to Christianity, because we believe that birds adapt and develop to suit their surroundings. What we don't believe is that over time they're able to become something different than birds. So, Jonathan Wells, let's see, he says, I paused for a moment while I took some notes. Before we go any further, I said, let's get our definitions straight. When some people say evolution, they mean merely that there has been change over time, but that's not an accurate description, is it? To which Jonathan Wells replied, absolutely not. If that's all that there was to Darwinism, then there wouldn't be any controversy, because we all agree that there have been biological change over time. Others define evolution as just being descent with modification, but again, everyone agrees that all organisms within a single species are related through descent with modification. This occurs in the ordinary course of biological reproduction. Darwinism claims much more than that. It's the theory that all living creatures are modified descendants of a common ancestor that lived long ago. You and I, for example, are descendants of ape-like ancestors. In fact, we share a common ancestor with fruit flies. Darwinism claims that every new species that has ever appeared can be explained by descent with modification. Neo-Darwinism claims that these modifications are the result of natural selection acting on random genetic mutations. So this is the ambitious claim of Darwinism. The ambitious claim of macroevolution is that, first of all, everything in the universe descended from a common ancestor. That's one element. And then the second element is that descent with modification accounts for all of the diversity of creation. These are the disputed claims. Everybody agrees on microevolution. The question is whether macroevolution is also true. So just to lay all my cards on the table, what we're going to be talking about here is really the question of whether these icons of evolution, whether the theory of macroevolution itself is science or mythology. And what I am going to attempt to demonstrate, and what I believe Lee Strobel has done a good job of demonstrating through Jonathan Wells, is that these icons of evolution are false, or at the very least very misleading. So the very images used to teach evolution theory constantly misrepresent the facts. And so then the question is, how can we actually trust evolution theory at all if the theory is rooted in these false or misleading examples? So now somebody might say, well, you have these examples are false, but the evidence still supports evolution. Okay, fine. Show me in the comments, show me the actual evidence, and we can talk about that. But if you show me something that's been refuted, then we're going to be talking about it, and we're going to see how it's refuted, and that's how it is. You're telling me that when I finally find Nemo, he isn't at least my cousin. Right, exactly. No matter how many Finding Nemo movies they make. Why is Nemo always getting lost, by the way? Like, why are we always having to find Nemo? No. It's actually a pretty fun movie, but silly. So the first of the icons of evolution is the Miller Experiment. So we talked last time about what the Miller Experiment is. I'm not going to rehash all of that, but basically the Miller Experiment was he tried to recreate what he thought the early Earth atmosphere was like, and then showed that he could create amino acids, basically. Well, I'm going to let Jonathan Wells get into it. I'm not going to rehash what I said last week. So what are the problems with the Miller Experiment? Well, first off, he had the wrong atmosphere. So Jonathan Wells says, Miller chose a hydrogen-rich mixture of methane, ammonia, and water vapor, which was consistent with what many scientists thought back then. But scientists don't believe that anymore. As a geophysicist with the Carnegie Institution said in the 1960s, what is the evidence for a primitive methane-ammonia atmosphere on Earth? The answer is that there is no evidence for it, but much evidence against it. By the mid-1970s, Belgian biochemist Marcel Flourkin was declaring that the concept behind Miller's theory of the early atmosphere has been abandoned. Two of the leading origin of life researchers, Klaus Doss and Sidney Fox, confirmed that Miller had used the wrong gas mixture. And Science magazine said in 1995 that experts now dismiss Miller's experiment because the early atmosphere looked nothing like what Miller simulated. So then Lee Strobel asks, what's the current thinking of science concerning the gas content of the early Earth? To which Jonathan Wells replies, the best hypothesis now is that there was very little hydrogen in the atmosphere because it would have escaped into space. Instead, the atmosphere probably consisted of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapor. So My gripe is that textbooks still present the Miller experiment as though it reflected Earth's early environment, when most geochemists since the 1960s would say that it was totally unlike Miller's experiment. So Lee Strobel asks, what happens if you repeat the experiment with a more accurate early atmosphere? To which Jonathan Wells replies, I'll tell you this, you don't get amino acids, that's for sure. Some textbooks fudge by saying, well, even if you use a realistic atmosphere, you still get organic molecules, as if that solves the problem. And actually, that sounds pretty promising. Organic molecules. I'm not a biochemist. Lee Strobel says, I'm not a biochemist, but couldn't those be precursors to life? To which Jonathan Wells recoiled and responded, that's what they sound like. But do you know what they are? They're formaldehyde and cyanide, he declared, his voice rising for emphasis. They may be organic molecules, but in my lab at Berkeley, you couldn't even have a capped bottle of formaldehyde in the room because the stuff is so toxic. You open the bottle and it fries proteins all over the place. Just from the fumes, it kills embryos. The idea that using a realistic atmosphere gets you the first step in the origin of life is just laughable. Now, it's true that a good organic chemist can turn formaldehyde and cyanide into biological molecules, but to suggest that formaldehyde and cyanide give you the right substrate for the origin of life, he said, breaking into a chuckle, well, it's just a joke. Let the point sink in before delivering the clincher. Do you know what you actually get? He asked. You get embalming fluid. So you do not get the building blocks of life that the Miller experiment is touted as giving you. Instead, what you get is something very hostile to life. So the problem that I see is that this experiment is still presented as if it proves that the basic building blocks of life can arise out of non-life. It still is presented as though Miller has proved something that is absolutely not proved. And so the Miller experiment has been roundly debunked. Scientists themselves, people respected in science themselves, no longer believe that the Miller experiment has any weight whatsoever in the discussion. So my gripe is, why is the Miller experiment still appearing in textbooks as if it proves that religion is unnecessary and life can just arise out of non-life through natural processes, when that has been soundly debunked? But let's go a step further. Because even if the Miller experiment did work, which it doesn't, but even if it somehow did work, you still wouldn't actually get life. So, Lee Strobel says, look, I understand that it's not chemically possible to get amino acids, but let's say that it was, or let's say that amino acids came to Earth on a comet or some other way. My question is this. How far would that be from creating a living cell? To which Jonathan Wells replies, oh, very far, incredibly far. That would be the first step in an extremely complicated process. You would have to get the right number of the right kinds of amino acids to link up to create a protein molecule, and that would still be a long way from a living cell. Then you would need dozens of protein molecules, again, all in the right sequence in order to create a living cell. And the odds against this are astonishing. The gap between non-living chemicals and even the most primitive of living organisms is absolutely tremendous. Let me describe it this way. Put a sterile, balanced salt solution in a test tube, then put a single living cell and poke a hole in it so that its contents leak into the solution. Now the test tube has all the molecules you would need to create a living cell. You've already accomplished far more than the Miller experiment ever could. You've got all the components you need for life. The problem is you can't make a living cell. There's not even any point in trying. It would be like a physicist doing an experiment to see if he can get a rock to fall upward all the way to the moon. No biologist in his right mind would think that you can take a test tube with all those molecules and turn them into a living cell. The point is, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Even if you have all the molecules you would need, it doesn't matter. You still can't get them together. You can't force them together. And if you can't force them together and create a living cell out of non-life, then how is Henry Miller saying that these things just happened by chance? That's impossible. And more important than that is the fact that, again, you don't actually get these amino acids at all. So that's the first thing, is Henry Miller's experiment is incorrect. It's actually impossible to get these amino acids arising out of non-life in the first place. But even if you could somehow do that, you would still be so astronomically far away from having a living organism that it does not prove anything similar to what we're being told it proves. Lee Strobel says, but I protested. The first cell was probably a lot more primitive than even the simplest single-cell organisms of today. Granted, Jonathan replied, but my point remains the same. The problem of assembling the right parts in the right way at the right time in the right place while keeping out all the wrong material is simply insurmountable. Frankly, the idea that we're on the verge of explaining the origin of life naturalistically is just silly. So even the simplest, the most rudimentary cell could not be formed in this way. So now the question is there any theory that can rescue the experiment? Wells stroked his salt and pepper beard. The word theory is very slippery, he replied. I can make up a story, but it would be unsupported at every crucial step by any experimental evidence worth counting. I'm an experimentalist at heart. I'd want to see some evidence, and it's just not there. For instance, one popular theory is that RNA, a close relative of DNA, could have been a molecular cradle from which early cells developed. This RNA world hypothesis was heralded as a great possibility for a while, but nobody could demonstrate how RNA could have formed before living cells were around to make it, or how it could have survived under conditions on the early Earth. Gerald Joyce, a biochemist at the Scripps Research Institute, ruled out the RNA first theory very colorfully by saying, quote, you would have to build straw man upon straw man to get to the point where RNA is a viable first biochemical, end quote. In short, declared Wells, it is a dead end, as all other theories have been. So, yes, there are theories, if you will, that try to rescue the Miller experiment, but these theories are no more valid than your uncle's crazy, your tinfoil hat wearing uncle's crazy conspiracy theories. It's time for us to be real skeptics here and simply address the elephant in the room, that the Henry Miller experiment is a failure. It's debunked. It doesn't prove anything at all, except that you could theoretically make cyanide and formaldehyde. So you can make embalming fluid in the early Earth, but you can't make anything that is even remotely a building block for life. So, as far as the scientific significance of the Henry Miller experiment, it has some historic significance, but it has no scientific significance. And its historic significance is only that it convinced a lot of people throughout the years that life could have arisen spontaneously, but it has no scientific relevance today because it has demonstrated no such thing. So Jonathan Wells says, unfortunately, it is far more than a footnote in many textbooks. It is prominently featured in current textbooks, often with pictures. The most generous thing I can say is that it's misleading. It's wrong to even give the impression that science has empirically shown that life could have originated. Now, they may have a disclaimer buried somewhere in the text that the Earth's atmosphere may not have been what Miller thought it was, but then they say that if a realistic environment is used, you can still get organic molecules. To me, that is just misleading. I thought about a student who encounters the Miller experiment today. Would he gloss over in his mind the complexities of creating life? Would he understand the nuances of the Miller story, or would he hear the term organic molecules and conclude that scientists are on the verge of resolving the problem of how non-living chemicals somehow came from living cells? Would a young person looking for an excuse to escape the accountability of God cling to the false conclusion that the origin of life is probably only a minor obstacle in the relentless march of evolutionary theory? Why do you think the Miller experiment is still published in textbooks? I asked. Wells shrugged. It's becoming clearer and clearer to me that this materialistic philosophy masquerading as imperial science, materialistic philosophy masquerading as empirical science. The attitude is that life had to have developed in this way because there is no other materialistic explanation. And you try to invoke another explanation, for instance, intelligent design, then the evolutionists claim that you're not being scientific, end quote. I see this as an example of basking in regressive ignorance. I get that term from a debate that happened on Twitter, of all places, between a rapper named B.O.B., who Moldy Apple says Pompeii was historically significant too. Time to hop in and become part of history. Exactly. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, and a rapper who's a prominent atheist, whatever, got into a pretty heated debate over social media with a rapper named B.O.B. because this rapper joined something called the Flat Earth Society and was very vociferously defending his belief that the Earth is flat. And after going back and forth for a while, Neil deGrasse Tyson said that B.O.B. is free to bask in regressive ignorance, as long as you're not in charge of anything. In other words, it's fine for him to believe that the Earth is flat and make rap music. The problem is if he became a pilot and had to chart a flight course, or became an air traffic controller and had to chart a flight course. And in order to do that, he would need to factor in the curvature of the Earth, which he doesn't believe exists. But my problem is that to borrow the phrase from Neil deGrasse Tyson. People like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are in charge of writing America's textbooks that influence our young people, are themselves basking in this regressive ignorance regarding the theory of evolution. And so long as they're doing that, they are causing a problem. I thoroughly agree with Neil deGrasse Tyson that it really doesn't matter if people want to bask in regressive ignorance, and it's damaging to their own souls, but it's not damaging to society if some guy wants to believe that he's a woman, or if some guy wants to believe that evolution happened. It becomes a problem when the people writing our science textbooks believe these nonsensical ideas. Interestingly enough, I really love this last section here from our book, as far as life couldn't. What does the Henry Miller experiment attempt to show is that life could have arisen naturalistically. What are scientists actually saying? Well, let's take a look. Many other scientists have reached the same conclusion. Science doesn't have the slightest idea how life began. Journalist Greg Easterbrook once wrote about the origin of life field. No generally accepted theory exists, and the steps leading from a barren, primordial world to the fragile chemistry of life seem imponderable, end quote. Bradley not only shares that view, but he said that the mind-boggling difficulties in bridging the yawning gap between non-life and life mean that there may very well be no potential of ever finding a theory of how life could have arisen spontaneously. That's why he's convinced that the absolutely overwhelming evidence points towards an intelligence behind life's creation. In fact, he said, quote, I think people who believe that life emerged naturalistically need to have a great deal more faith than people who reasonably infer that there is an intelligent designer, end quote. Even those who look askance at religious faith have been forced to conclude that the odds against spontaneous creation of life are so absurdly high that there must be more to the creation story than mere materialistic processes. They can't help but invoke the only word that seems to realistically account for it all: miracle. It's a label many scientists are loath to use, but which circumstances seem to demand. For instance, one of the country's leading science journalists, John Horgan, who identifies himself as a lapsed Catholic, conceded in 2002 that scientists have no idea how the universe was created or, quote, how inanimate matter on our little planet coalesced into living creatures, end quote. Then came that word, quote, science, you might say, has discovered that our existence is an infinitely improbable miracle, end quote. Even biochemist and spiritual skeptic Francis Crick, who shared the Nobel Prize for discovering the molecular structure of DNA, cautiously invoked the word a few years ago. Quote, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied in order to get it going, end quote. Others are more adamant. If there is a natural explanation and there doesn't seem to be a potential of finding one, if there isn't a naturalistic explanation and there doesn't seem to be a potential of finding one, then I believe it is appropriate to look at the supernatural explanation, said Bradley. I think the most reasonable inference based on the evidence. Which, by the way, that gets at a point that I have often made, which is people say all the time that, oh, I only believe a rational explanation. I believe there has to be a rational explanation. If you talk about the supernatural, they say, no, there has to be a rational explanation. Well, That's absurd, because you're actually ruling out possible rational explanations, and you're saying that there has to be a materialistic explanation. But materialism is itself irrational. So you're actually being irrational by making an idol out of supposedly rational explanations. Moldy Apple says, you can be in charge when you make an idol out of scopes, Bunsen burners, and beakers. Exactly. So, science is pointing us to design, not random chance. Now, we're going to stop there for now because we've already been going for an hour. And next week, we're going to start at Darwin's Tree of Life. So we're going to be picking up at this idea of Darwin's tree, wherein he claims that all living organisms spread out and spawn from one thing. But before you go, I want to encourage you not only to recognize the evidence for the existence of a creator. I know that we're seeing the word miracle being invoked and all these things, and I know that some of you are going to be tempted to make fun of me for saying this, and I'm okay with that. But don't just learn about this creator. Don't just learn facts about this creator. Don't just learn that this creator exists. I want to urge you to come to the Orthodox Church, attend the Divine Liturgy, and get to know your creator. Not just know about him. Get to know him. Come to actually have a relationship with him. And so that's what I want to leave you with. Moldy Apple says they use the term emergent all the time. Exactly. That's exactly right. They're constantly invoking this term emergent. Watch any science documentary and you'll hear this term emergent invoked over and over again. And what does that term imply? It implies the miraculous. But don't stop there. Don't stop at knowing that that there is a God. Come to know the God and come to know him personally and have a personal relationship with him in Christ. Thank you for watching. Please do share this with your friends, especially your snarky atheist friends, so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.